Yeah?
Yeah.
No. Not exactly. Here we go. Maybe if I talk directly into the mic, that helps. Yeah. Hello, my name is Derek Michaud, and I'm the coordinator of the Judaic Studies program here at the University of Maine. Judaic Studies is an academic minor in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences that offers courses in Judaism, Jewish history, and Hebrew to complement any major across the university. The program is supported by the Norman Minsky Fund for Judaic Studies and by donations from members of the community, like you, to the Judaic Studies Enhancement Fund. For more information about Judaic Studies, you'll find a flyer at the back of the hall, or you can find us at maine.edu/Judaic Studies. Now, our event this evening has been planned, postponed, rescheduled, and then rescheduled again. And I think I have that right. During this COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, it was one of the first events that I planned when I became coordinator a couple of years ago. So it's terrific to finally welcome you all here, both in person at the beautiful Minsky Recital Hall on the campus of the University of Maine, named for the late and much missed Leonard Minsky and his wife, Renee. And of course, those watching online from around the world. The University of Maine recognizes that we are located this evening on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. This evening marks the start of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Our speaker tonight, internationally acclaimed musician, researcher, and University of Maine professor of music, Phillip Silver, will tell us the story of how he has rescued the music of Jewish composers that the Nazis tried to silence. As we pause to remember, as we must, the victims of the Shoah, Professor Silver and his wife Noreen will bring forth sounds from silence. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank everyone who organized this, and those who waited 3 years for it to finally happen. My research, as you heard, is to rescue music and rescue the reputation of people who were written out of history. The Nazis made it very, very clear at the beginning of their rule that there was going to be no place in German society for Jewish art, culture, philosophy. One of the first laws that were passed under the new regime was a law to reform the civil service in Germany. And one of the salient points of the law was that only Aryans could be hired for civil service positions. Civil service positions in Germany included orchestras, opera houses, art galleries, universities. Basically, at one swoop, one signature of a pen, the Nazis removed virtually every Jewish artist from public life overnight. And this includes composers as well. A number of these composers were written out of history. Their music was banned, couldn't get them performed. Their contribution to society was nullified. The plates that were used to print their music were destroyed. The music I have been uncovering over the past decade, maybe 2 decades now, was meant to be lost forever. But my research is directed towards making certain that it is not lost. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit of how I came to do this. It came about shortly after I was hired by this university. A very disturbing event happened. In the campus newspaper, there was a full-page ad from a Holocaust-denying organization casting aspersions on the veracity of the Holocaust and Elie Wiesel, one of the most eloquent post-Holocaust voices. It was extremely disturbing to see that. And from that incentive, the feeling arose, I have to do something. I cannot be passive about this. There is going to be a time, and the time is now actually, in which the majority, if not all, virtually all of the Holocaust survivors will have passed away. There will not be an eyewitness voice any longer. And what is necessary is to have some way to create an eyewitness experience. How, as a musician, I thought, am I going to be able to preserve historical truth? And I began to think back to experiences that I had had. One, I lived for about 6 years in Israel. And one of my close friends there was a musicologist, David Bloch. He was in charge of musicology at Tel Aviv University, and one of the first to begin exploring what we now think of as suppressed music. From David, I learned a lot. Then there was also an experience driving and having the radio on when I was probably in England at the time, and hearing this most extraordinarily beautiful string quartet. And then, when it was over, finding out it was composed in a concentration camp, and that the composer was murdered in Auschwitz in the gas chambers. And this immediately suggested itself, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. I have to find people who have been treated like dirt, and I have to find a way to bring them back into the historical record. Beside performance, one of the first things that I did was start a series, a yearly series called Thwarted Voices, that took place here. Some people might even remember that. It's been a long time ago. It was a combination of narrative, poetry, and music dealing with the Holocaust in this context that I've just described earlier. I then designed a course called Art de Musique, Degenerate Music, which is what the Nazis called this music. And it was a course which followed the entire sorry saga of the beginning of the anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish artists by Richard Wagner into the Nazi period itself. And it's a course that I periodically teach here and also have taught for about 10 years at Colby College. There are many lectures that are taken out of that course that I use for international lecturing as well. This evening I thought it would be interesting for me to illustrate 3 of the composers that I have found, 3 of the composers that I've devoted a great deal of time on, finding about their lives, finding about their music, playing their music, in some instances recording their music. We put out commercial CDs through a label in London. These composers come from different backgrounds, but they all suffered the same fate. None of them survived the Holocaust. The 3 composers are the Italian-born Leone Sinigalia, the German-born James Simon, and the Czech-born Otto Schweig. And I'll begin by discussing Leone Sinigalia very briefly. A man born in 1868, he died in 1944. How did I find out about this composer? Well, it was by accident. I was doing research in Tel Aviv in the archives of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. I was collecting information about the early years. The orchestra was formed with refugees in 1936. The first concerts were conducted by Arturo Toscanini. And I wanted to know more about what went on at that time. And on one of the concert posters, there was a concert that took place on April 13, 1938. There was a listing of a composition by a composer named Leone Senegalia, whom I had never heard of. And when I asked people about him, virtually nothing was known about him either. So this whetted my appetite, my curiosity for certain, and I began to question people, began to make phone calls. This was in the early days before research was easy to do over the internet. And phone calls and letters were part and parcel, waiting weeks for answers. Yeah, those were terrible days in many respects. And then I found out, yeah, he was a student in Vienna. He studied with a friend of Johannes Brahms, a man named Eusebius Mandaczewski. He studied there for 3 years. Afterwards, he went to Prague and he studied with Dvorak. What really intrigued me is that he was a mountain climber as well. And he wrote a book that was published in the later part of the 19th century about his climbing in the Dolomite Mountains, which is still available today in many different languages. It turns out during the course of his life, he became best known as an ethnomusicologist. He composed very few pieces. His last opus number was Opus 44. And finding the music, to see what it was like, was not easy. I began to glean certain bits of information. There was a sonata for cello. There was a sonata for violin. But where? Where was it? He composed it, but where was it? So I began calling in some friends, asking them for information. And one of them said, I should try Breitkopf and Hertel in Germany. And so I called them. And they told me that, yeah, they had published his sonata in the 1920s. But they were pretty certain there were no copies left in the archives. Now don't forget, the Nazis wanted to destroy all existing printed copies and the plates, so nothing else could be printed. It's possible, I thought, maybe this is what happened here. But at the moment that I was about to go off in another direction, I received a letter from Germany. They had found a copy. And it was sent to me. And I was, to be honest with you, I was shocked by the quality of the music. It was music that was immensely endearing. And it's music that, under no circumstances, should have been lost to history. I'd like to begin the musical part of the program. I'll come back and talk again, don't worry about that. And the musical part of the program by playing a movement from the Sonata for Cello and Piano by Senegalia, my wife Noreen, of course, joining me. This is a work that we recorded for the Toccata Classics label in London. It used to be available, it might not be any longer, but it was out there for a while.
Third movement of the Sonata by Senegalia. It's an adagio.
think you'll agree, an extremely beautiful piece of music that should never have been forgotten historically. What happened to Senegalia? On May 16, 1944, the Nazis instituted a roundup of Italian Jews for transport to Auschwitz. Senegalia had taken refuge in a hospital in Turin. He was discovered, and he died of a heart attack as he was captured. He was 75 years of age at the time. The second composer, James Seymour, born in 1880, died in 1944. A Berlin-born composer, pianist, and musicologist. His musical leanings were always very much toward the 19th century. He didn't live in our time, according to his son, who was interviewed after his father's death. He said that his father lived in a make-believe world, an Alice in Wonderland world. He would not register what was actually going on. And this unawareness was much more than simply musical unawareness of what was happening. It was also social and political unawareness. He had a number of opportunities to save his life, and he lost every single one of them, not recognizing the danger that he actually faced. The first opportunity took place in 1938. His sister was dying. She was living in Tel Aviv at the time. He hurriedly went there to try to see her before her death. Didn't succeed from what I understand. But after he arrived there, family members, both in Europe and in Israel, tried to convince him to stay. Hebrew University offered him a position as a professor. He had everything being handed to him. He refused. He went back to Europe. He felt himself a European. Opportunity number one, gone. Opportunity number two, he's offered an affidavit from the United States to allow him to enter America. He refuses. His son says that he was a terrible linguist and he always felt insecure about speaking any other language besides German, and therefore he couldn't leave. So, 2 opportunities lost. His fate was sealed when the Nazis invaded Holland. As I mentioned, he was a German-born composer. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, he, like many other Germans, went to the Netherlands for sanctuary. And he stayed there until he was trapped by the Nazi invasion. And the Nazis imposed the racial laws that had been in practice in Germany. In other words, Simon could no longer have his music performed in public. He himself was a pianist. He couldn't play in public any longer. The only opportunity for the Jewish artists in the Netherlands was to play in house concerts. And what began to happen is that the Dutch population began to organize these house concerts to enable the now destitute Jewish artists to survive economically. And he was able to do so for a short while. I'm going to discuss this Dutch part of his life in a moment. I just want to point out that I came to know him because of a composition he wrote for that brief time he stayed in Tel Aviv to try to see his sister before her death. He composed a lament for cello and piano, and he said it's in Yemenite fashion. He composed it in 1938 to commemorate his sister. This music was given to me by my friend David Bloch, who I already mentioned earlier this evening. It was a piece of music that had an otherworldly beauty to it. It felt like a different world springing up. And I think we should play that piece for you right now. 2015, I had acquired a substantial amount of material about this composer, so much so that I organized a full evening lecture and performance event out of it. And one of the venues that I performed it was at the Academy of Music in Jerusalem. And as a result of that lecture recital, I was given a photocopy of an invitation to a concert, an invitation to one of the house concerts in Amsterdam. And what was fascinating about it is that it listed two names performing. James Simon was the pianist, and the violinist was Alma Rosé, the niece of Gustav Mahler, who would eventually die in Auschwitz herself. And because of the Dutch connection, I felt it would be worthwhile to contact an organization in Amsterdam called the Leo Smit Stichting. It's a foundation named after Leo Smit. He is a composer that was murdered during the Holocaust. And they established themselves to basically bring back to life the music of the Dutch composers who were victimized during the Holocaust. And I presented them with the information about, first, he lived in Holland for years, and then look at this notice of a concert, etc. As a result of it, they felt that it might be interesting for us to collaborate and to do something about this composer. And in 2018, it resulted in a full performance, the first concert ever devoted completely to the music of this composer. We performed that in Amsterdam. It had the world premiere performance of a sextet for piano and winds, and this was later broadcast over Dutch Radio 4. Also at that time, in collaboration with one of the people in the foundation, I co-wrote the first English language biography of this man, which is available on the internet. The music he wrote sounds like that, but it also is dramatic, full of romantic elements, and I think we have enough time to play it. We have another piece we want to get in. So. This is a sonata for cello and piano, written by James Simon. It's one of the few works that was actually published during his lifetime. Much of the material exists only in manuscript.
It's the first movement of the sonata.
what happened to James Seymour, actually. On October 12th, 1944, he was placed on a transport to Auschwitz. He was murdered upon arrival there. According to an article that was published after the war in a German emigre newspaper in New York, an eyewitness stated that they had seen him in the cattle car, sitting on his suitcase, scribbling musical ideas on a piece of paper, not knowing he was going to his death. One final composer. This is a composer I have only discovered fairly recently, and the mode of discovery is almost unbelievable when you think about it, chance interfering in this. The composer's name is Otto Schweig. He was born in 1874, died in 1942. There is an online source of musical scores called IMSLIP, the International Music Score Library Project. There are over 200,000 scores available through this organization for free downloading. I thought it might be interesting, not having anything else to do one afternoon, to simply open into a page in the alphabetical database and just basically hit a name and see what comes up. And I hit Otto Schweig, and there was one piece in there. It was an early work for piano, and it was very good. So I began to find out more and more about him, and discovered that he was a part-time composer who probably knew Senegal because he studied with the same teacher at about the same point in time in Vienna. He did not devote his life to music because the family had a business, and it was expected that as the next son in line, he would take over the business, which he did. But he kept composing, and he composed works for piano solo, violin and piano, cello and piano. He composed a lot of songs. He composed at least one work with orchestra. The music was difficult to find. After I had found this one work on IMSLIP, no one knew where to look next. And of course, after a number of different inquiries, somebody came up with a bright idea. Well, he's Czech. Why don't you check in the National Library, the Moravian National Library? And so I did. I went on to their site, and lo and behold, they possess all of his manuscripts, a collection. Ordinarily, I would have gone over there. And with this much material, I want to be there on site. But the library was closed to the public because of the pandemic. And so I ordered everything, which was photocopied for me, digitalized, and sent to me as files. And I began to work with some of the music, which you will hear shortly is a bit different than what we've heard before. It's not so dramatic. It's more of a blending between salon music and light classical, I would say. But it is extremely lovely music that deserves to be heard. We are running out of time, so therefore I'm going to just play this piece with my wife right now, and then come back and make my concluding statements and take any questions if there are any. This work is entitled Romance, Cello and Piano. It is the only work I have found by this composer for this ensemble, this grouping. wife were placed on a transport to Terezin concentration camp. It's north of Prague. He only stayed there for a few days. He was then placed on a transport on October 15th to Treblinka. Treblinka was one of the 6 extermination centers established by the Nazis. He was murdered along with his wife upon arrival. So, just to sum up tonight's work, I find that this is an essential duty of mine, to bring these composers and bring these pieces of music before the public again. I think the saying goes, if we do not do this for these composers, it is the equivalent of killing them a second time. They were banned, their lives were destroyed, their futures were taken from them. If we don't do something, then their sacrifice is in vain. So, I thank you very much for coming, and if there are any questions, I'll be very, very glad to try and answer them. Yes?
For the pieces written by people like who died in the camps, did they ever have a chance to listen to any of their music live, or were they just writing it in kind of new music theory and how it worked?
It depends on the camp they went to. One camp, Terezin, was a public relations exercise for the Nazis to bring outside forces like the Red Cross, as they did, and show how well they treated Jews. There was an orchestra. The composers were encouraged to write and to have their works performed. But that was a rarity. That was a very, very rare occasion. It wasn't in other camps. Yes?
Are you able to estimate in your studies how much work was lost altogether?
We know individual pieces that were lost, but the entire thing, no, at this point, because we're still at the point where new composers seem to be discovered that we never heard of before. James Simon, for instance, spent time in Terezin, but we never knew that until a couple of years ago. So we're finding new information, and we have to hear about works that were performed there that we don't have. So like we know one composer was working on a piano concerto in Terezin. We don't have it. Another composer wrote music for a recitation of a poem. It was played in the camp. People commented on how powerful it was. The music has disappeared. So we know individual pieces, but not as a whole how many. Yes?
Do you have a website, a database, a book, some kind of place where you collect all your research that is accessible to the public?
What I do is I make the music accessible to the public. The organization I told you about, IMSLIP, certain composers like James Simon, there are about 9 of his compositions available now for downloading. 2 years ago, I think there was 1 piece there. I know I put about 6 or 7 pieces, and now someone else joined and added a piece. So this is how I'm doing it, getting the music out there and not the other parts, because there are academic areas in which this can be researched. There are organizations that specialize in it. I think it's more important to get the results of the research than discuss the research. Does that answer your question? No?
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you would want to know more about this or learn more about these composers, where would you find that information?
I would go to a site in Holland. I would go onto the Leo Smith Stichting website, and they have a subsidiary site, it's parallel, I believe it's called Forbidden Music, and they have biographies of a great number of composers. They have to have some relationship to the Netherlands. They also have every piece that is known by them listed, and where it can be found, if it can be found, etc. So it's quite an extensive database. And that's what I would recommend most. Yes?
It looks like this is being taped. Are you going to post it?
Somebody else is going to post it. I have no idea.
Yes.
Yeah. It will be posted. Yes?
Can you comment briefly on the status of Jewish European composers prior to the Nazi regime?
Prior to the Nazi regime, it was microphone. Prior to the Nazi regime, it depends really what country you're in. In Germany, there were many Jewish composers that were writing. I mean, just think of Arnold Schoenberg, for instance. Franz Schreker was composing a lot. These are composers. Schreker may not be too well known here, but he was one of the giants of the period. In France, there were a huge number of Jewish composers that were composing. Darius Milhaud being perhaps the prize example of that. So there was a great and lively flow of activity from the Jewish artists. It all came to a close once the Nazis took power. They closed it off in Germany, and then every other country they conquered, they instilled the same type of repression. Yes?
Philip, are there other people doing what you're doing, finding this music, looking for this music?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I assume there would be.
Yeah.
Like lots?
Not as many as I would like to have, to be honest with you. I belong to two different organizations, one in the UK and one in Germany, which is doing a lot of work right now, Musica Reanimata. They're based in Berlin. And they are, I think, doing the most right now in an organized fashion. Also the Leo Stiftung. They are extremely active. I can't recommend them highly enough, having worked with them and seeing how they actually operate. Yes?
How about women composers?
Women composers. There were a few women composers. We think of, I'm trying to think of a woman who was murdered in Auschwitz, who wrote poetry primarily in terrorism concentration camp and set some of it to song. And the name escapes me at the moment. There were composers who worked with Franz Schreker. They were part of his class in Berlin. They went into exile, and basically their careers just ended at that point. It ended for many people who went into exile, but the women had a very difficult time. And I wish I could be more positive about it, but I don't have the information to give you that's positive. Yes?
I just have the need to thank you for all the work you've done in giving us this opportunity.
I have to thank you, because without you, I'm literally whistling in the dark. So, it's a mutual relationship.
Back more lectures with more research.
I'll be happy to, but not tonight. Thank you again.